As we're gonna end this series in Colossians. We've been in Colossians for several weeks now. Such an important little letter of the New Testament, and so I hope that if you haven't been able to hear all of it, you'll go online and listen to it or watch it. But I wanted to end today by telling you a story. It happened in 1962. Some of you might remember something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. But around that time frame, 1962, a guy named Vasily Arkhipov was a Russian commander of a fleet of Russian submarines. There were 4 of them. And during this time, during this Cuban Missile Crisis, these 4 subs, they were told to go out to sea. And when they got out to sea, they would be able to open then what their instructions from Moscow were. But they couldn't open them until they got out to sea. So they go out to sea, they open up, and they find out that their mission is that they're to go 5,000 miles southwest down the coast and guard the city of Havana, Cuba. Now, when they did that, they were severely tested. They surfaced so they could go faster for a time, but when they did that, they ran into Hurricane Daisy. And the crew were sick. The submarines were 120 degrees. These were submarines that weren't meant to go in the Pacific, in the Caribbean waters, but rather in the Arctic waters. And so they were just not good. They were stressed. They were sick. Everybody was on edge. Everybody was tense, and they weren't really sure what they were doing. And then to top that off, then Moscow sent word that they were to move from Havana closer to the coast of Florida. Well, I thought that's kind of weird, but it didn't make any sense, but they did it. And when they did it, even though they were way down, they were immediately surrounded by U.S. warships and destroyers. October 27, 1962. These 4 Russian submarines were down way deep. They were down way deep. And they were surrounded by these ships and destroyers. And so the U.S. started to set off what was called depth charges. These deep water explosions meant to bring up whatever was down there. And so that's what they started doing. Now, the submarine of the 4 that Vasily Arkhipov was on was called the B-59. And it was way down deep. In fact, it was down so deep it wasn't getting any communication. But all they knew was they kept hearing these charge explosions, and they thought the war had broken out. And so the captain of that particular submarine lost his cool, and he called a meeting between himself, Arkhipov, and a 3rd officer on that submarine. It was kind of the lead submarine. And the captain lost his mind. He wanted to engage in war. He lost his cool. Now, what the Americans didn't know was that each of those 4 Soviet submarines had a nuclear warhead on each one of them. Just one of them could have done horrific damage. Basically, it would have set off a full-on nuclear war. Fortunately, Vasily Arkhipov was on that submarine, and he was one of those 3 officers. And where the other 2 wanted to fire torpedoes, it was Vasily Arkhipov who kept calm. He was quiet, he was soft-spoken, and he asked the captain to reconsider firing. He said, "Shouldn't we surface first and see what's going on?" And somehow his calmness persuaded the captain against his pride to surface. And when they did, they realized that there was no war going on. A few hours later, they were headed back to the Soviet Union. Speaking of this incident at the time, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara said, "We came so close to nuclear war, you can't even believe it." Another advisor for President Kennedy said this was not just the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. He said this was the most dangerous moment in the entire history of the world. Now, for 40 years, the world never knew anything about this. It was top secret until 2002. Nobody ever knew anything about it. Nobody ever heard of Vasily Arkhipov for the most part. But what would have happened if he would have not been on that submarine? That's hard telling. I love stories. I love stories about people who make a huge impact on the world, yet largely go unnoticed and maybe even unheard of. I love stories like that. There's many of them in our nation's history. There's also a lot of them, frankly, in the history of the church. And there's always been a lot of people in the church, Christians, who have faithfully served the Lord and faithfully just done what they thought God wanted them to do. But we don't often talk about them. We don't celebrate them. A lot of them we don't even know. Now we get to the last part of Colossians in chapter 4, and we see this list of names. And it's so easy just to skip over them because we don't know who they are. It's kind of like the genealogies in the Gospels. We just kind of, and we skip over them, right? But we need to look at these people. They need to be remembered. There's a guy named Sam Stone who many years ago preached a pretty famous sermon called Forgotten People Whom We Must Never Forget. And so we need to not forget these people that Paul highlights here, because this isn't just a list of people. This is the church. And there's a story behind each of these names. And each of these names played an important role in Christianity. And we're going to look at some of these stories. Aristarchus, for example, was in prison with Paul. They had endured hard times together. Mark was a missionary, and with Paul, he was a cousin of Barnabas, one of the few Jewish believers who would spend time with Paul when Paul first became a Christian. The rest of them were afraid, and they suspected him that he wasn't sincere. Well, Luke was a doctor. He was a missionary companion of Paul. Luke wrote more of the New Testament than the Apostle Paul did. We read of a lady named Nympha. She was a woman who evidently had the gift of hospitality. The church in Colossae actually met in her home. And so how they did it back in that time, that would have sort of de facto made her a leader in the church. In fact, if we look at this list, and if we look at other similar lists, especially the one in Romans 16, we see that Paul lists a lot of women, so many women who were so instrumental in the gospel. And then we read the book of Acts, and it's clear that women were every bit as involved in the work of the church, providing instruction, providing leadership. They were speaking, they were praying in the assembly. And so here we see in this list of names as well, Paul's other Christian brothers and sisters and friends that are so important to the work and unity of the church. Now, in 3 weeks, I'm going to start a new series, a little series on friendship. But we're going to kind of get a taste of that today, because we're going to look at what is it that makes a good friend, and why is it that Paul singled out these people to mention in his letter. So I want to look at some qualities of friendship and why Paul was so thankful for them. And the first one would be encouragement. Encouragement. In verse 7, Paul writes, "Now Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He's a dear brother and a faithful minister, and he's a fellow servant in the Lord." You know, he's not just a brother, not just a friend, but he's a dear brother. He's a faithful minister that worked alongside Paul, that was somebody that Paul could count on. And so Paul says in verse 8, "Now I'm sending him to you for the express purpose, so that you may know about our circumstances, and that he may encourage your hearts." Paul sent Tychicus to them because he knew that Tychicus had something they desperately needed at the church in Colossae, and that was encouragement. That was encouragement. We've talked over these many weeks about how the church had been infiltrated by these teachers that were trying to lead people astray, and they were disparaging Paul, and the Christians were so discouraged. And we need encouragement, I think, more than anything, especially in these days and in these times, that we would just encourage one another. And I think as Christian people, of all people, we need to really guard against being discouraging. We need to watch our tongue, watch our language. Like, there is nothing that sucks the air out of a room more than a discouraging word. And while home on the range, there seldom is heard a discouraging word, otherwise there's a discouraging word all over the place. I should know. Many of them have come out of my mouth. I remember, 15, 16 years ago, something like this. Lori had just gotten a job with the state, and we were so excited about it. She was excited. We went out to celebrate, and we're sitting there, and we're eating our meal, and she's saying, "No, this is going to be really helpful to us, and it's going to, provide some money and all these things." And I just kind of listened to her. And then I said, Mr. Sensitive pastor husband said, "Well, that's true." I said, "But, really it's all just going to go into savings anyway for college, so it really won't make much of a difference right now." I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. That's all she said. She looked at me and she said, "Chris, that's the most discouraging thing that you've ever said to me." Now, there's quite a list she could have chosen from, but that was like, how horrible of me And you know what it's like to have somebody do that to you, right? You're so excited about something or whatever it is, and somebody just like throws a cold bucket of water on you and says something totally discouraging. Discouraging things are said. Discouraging letters are written. Emails are sent. Tweets are tweeted. Texts are texted. Facebook posts, whatever it might be. But in the church, we need to guard against that sort of that discouragement in the church, in the body of Christ. We're to build one another up. Ephesians 4:3 says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. I love the way the Message translates it. It simply says, hey, stay together. Stay together. Stay together. Charles Darwin was a great complainer. He's often been called sort of the patron saint of complainers, which I think he would like because he wouldn't want to be called a saint of anything, but he was. The story's told about he and his wife. They were at a restaurant one night. Nothing was to his satisfaction. He complained about where they were seated. And then he complained about the draft that was on the back of his neck, and the soup was too cold, and the steak was too well done, and everything was just horrible. Finally, they finished their horrible meal, and Darwin went to the bathroom. The waiter came up to his wife and said, I am so sorry for your bad experience here. She looked at the waiter and goes, what do you mean bad experience? She said, it's his favorite thing to complain. He had everything to complain about. He had a great night. Thank you so much for that, right? In a church, when members aren't encouraging, it breeds a critical spirit. It leads to just a sense of doom and gloom and despair, and it also can lead to division. We need to encourage one another. Proverbs 14:25 says, an anxious heart wears a man down, but a kind word cheers him up. And it's so important that we understand that. Now, there's a couple more names that we see here, and it reminds us of the importance that friends ought to reconcile with one another, that we should not let things that divide us or differences of opinion or anything divide us, that we ought to reconcile. And so we're going to read about a guy named Onesimus in verse 9. So Paul writes, now Tychicus is coming with Onesimus, our dear friend and faithful brother, who is one of you, and they'll tell you everything that's happening here. So, well, who is this? We learned from a little letter of Paul, the tiny one-chapter letter of Philemon, we learn about this guy Onesimus and what was going on. So Onesimus, many of you probably know the backstory, but he was a slave. And he had it in his mind that he is sick of being a slave, and so he ran away from his master, a guy named Philemon. And evidently, at some point, Onesimus crosses paths with Paul, and imagine this, Paul converts him to Christianity, and so Onesimus becomes a Christian, and is evidently a great asset to the church, to the gospel, to the kingdom. And so Paul has to write Philemon, because Paul says, Onesimus, you got to go back there. And you got to reconcile with him. You got to make it right. You can't just like do this. And so Paul writes this little letter of Philemon to him to say, hey, when Onesimus comes back, you need to treat him according to what he is now. He's not your slave. He's your brother. He's one of us. He's one of you, Paul says. And so Paul, in Philemon verse 9, Paul says, I appeal to you on the basis of love. I love this. I'm an old man now. Like I'm an old man now. There's a little guilt in there, right? Like I'm an old man now, a prisoner of Jesus Christ. But I appeal to you, Philemon. I appeal to you to welcome him back. I'll pay you whatever it is that he might owe you. But you need to welcome him back as a brother in Christ. Now, Paul doesn't really talk about necessarily his stealing or the bad things that Onesimus has done, because now in Jesus he is a new creation in Christ. The old is gone, the new has come. And so Paul simply says, you need to accept him back because now he is one of you. He's one of you. He's a Christian. He's a brother. And I love the fact that God uses sinners and failures and runaway slaves and hardened people, all these different people, he uses them to make a difference in the kingdom of God. You think about it, he really didn't have a choice. That's all he's really got to work with, right? Because all of us are messed up. And so Paul's intervention spares the life of Onesimus, gains his freedom. And so evidently Onesimus was grateful enough to come back to be with Paul while he is in prison. A couple more names remind us that we're to forgive each other and not hold grudges. Verse 10, Paul talks about Aristarchus. He says, my fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Now, you've received instructions about him. If he comes to you, you welcome him. So we get the little backstory of what's going on here. We learn that, and we find out that Mark and Paul, about 12 years prior to this, they had a falling out. They had a severe, sharp contention, the Bible says. Now, Mark was the cousin to a guy named Barnabas. And Paul had taken Mark with him on a missionary journey, but in the middle of that missionary journey, Mark bailed out. He got homesick. We don't know what the reason is, whatever, but he bailed out and he went home. And Paul was hot. Like, Paul was upset about that. I mean, he's not running a pleasure cruise here. He was on a missionary journey. Life and death matters. Eternal lives at stake. And he was impatient with Mark. So on the second journey, they get ready to set out, and Paul says, hey, Barnabas, why don't we go and let's go retrace our route and check on the churches that we started there and see how they're doing. And Barnabas says, hey, that's great, Paul, but let's take Mark with us. And Paul says, no way, he's not dependable. He flaked out. And there was this sharp dispute, and they split up, they separated. And Paul took Silas with him, and Barnabas took Mark with him, and they went their separate ways. Now, we don't really know a whole lot about what happened to Mark and Barnabas after that, but evidently in the next 10 or 12 years, Mark is with Paul in prison. And in the little book of Philemon and in the book of 2 Timothy, Paul regards Mark at that point as a close friend. So evidently, in that time, they had reconciled, and Mark had redeemed himself, and they certainly had forgiven each other. And like we need to learn to forgive one another. There are going to be times, I don't care what an awesome person you are or what an awesome person your friend is, there are going to be times when your friend hurts you, and you're going to hurt them. You're going to disappoint them. You're going to be selfish, or you might imagine an offense. Maybe they're having a bad day, and they say something to you in the wrong tone of voice or whatever it is, and they make a comment to you, and you're offended. But the best approach is to forgive immediately, to overlook the offense. Don't demand an apology. Just let it go. Proverbs 17:9 says, he who covers an offense shows love, but whoever repeats the matter separates close friends. 1 Corinthians 13 says, love keeps no record of wrongs. Now, if the offense is so great that you just can't overlook it and it really needs to be confronted, then you need to do that. And Jesus tells us how to do that in Matthew 18. He gives sort of a list of steps to take and how you handle it. But the worst thing to do is to pout, is to keep your distance, is to avoid that person, is to give them the cold shoulder. That's not the loving thing to do. It's not the Christian thing to do. It's selfish. It's cowardly. But if it's an offense that needs to be dealt with, you go to the person, you do it quickly, in humility and love, you spend some time looking at the plank in your own eye before you go talk to them, and then you repair that friendship. And evidently, this is what Paul and Mark did. They became friends. They forgot the past. They forgave each other. In fact, and what may have very well been the very end of his life, he writes this in 2 Timothy 4:11. 2 Timothy is the last letter that Paul wrote. And he writes, Now, Timothy, come to me as quickly as you can, and please come before winter and bring the books with you. But then he says, and go get Mark. Go get Mark and bring him with you, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. So Paul calls for Mark. Evidently, both parties had swallowed their pride, had forgiven previous offenses, and the church was unified. And it's an amazing picture. But too often we don't do that. Too often we don't reconcile. We fight with one another. Pride, ego kicks in. I told you a couple stories of things that have happened in churches, and I could tell you many more, and I don't want to because it's very sad. But I want to tell you that this happens all the time in churches, and it grieves the heart of God. If ever there's a time when the church needs to be different than the world, when the church needs to be unified, and it doesn't matter where you fall in whatever spectrum, the church needs to be unified around Jesus Christ. And when we are not, it grieves God, because people look at us and go, see, they can't even get their own stuff together. Why would we want to have anything to do with the church? But get Mark. Bring him with you, because he's helpful to me in my ministry. I don't know about you. When I was in elementary school, one of our favorite things in gym class would be when our gym teacher, Mr. Hockemeyer was his name, he would come in and he would say, okay, open gym today. What do you guys want to do? And almost without exception, in unison, every kid in that room would say, war. And you say, well, what is war? How many of you know what war is? You've never heard of it? This must have been a Fort Wayne thing. Like we were evidently a lot tougher than Michigan people were. So war is essentially dodgeball on steroids, okay? There's 6 balls. They line the balls up in the center. He blows a whistle. There's 2 teams. And then you go run to be the first to get the balls. And then basically the goal is to try to kill somebody on the other side. This is like what the goal was, right? And so we loved it. It was fun. We loved it. And now I was sort of a bigger target in those days, and so I just kind of hung back and I waited, and I could throw really hard and I could hit people, but I couldn't move very well, and so I usually would be one of the last ones to survive. But this one day, there was 2 of us. There was me and another kid, and we were facing there were probably 10 more left on the other side, and he was behind me and I was kind of in front, and I, to this day, I don't know why. Don't know what prompted him to do this, but he took his ball and he drilled me in the back of my head as hard as he could. And if that weren't bad enough, then I hear the whistle blow. Coach Hockemeyer says, Higgins, you're out. You got hit. I was like, it's my own guy. He just, doesn't matter. You're out. And so after that, as you can imagine, and I still don't know why that kid did it, I'm not going to tell you his name. God knows his name, and that's enough for me. So, but nobody picked him ever again, and you can understand why. And I don't know, I just wonder sometimes if the God of the universe doesn't sometimes gather his angels together and kind of points down to the church, and he hears some things that people say about each other. Christians are struggling with a brother or sister, and they're talking bad things, and churches are dividing, and we can't get along. And I wonder if he doesn't say, don't they know that, don't they know they're on the same team? Don't they know? I think he does sometimes. 1986, 2 ships collided in the Black Sea off the coast of Russia. Hundreds of passengers died as they were hurled into the icy waters. Now, there was an investigation, as you can imagine, after that revealed the cause of what happened. And the cause of this horrible accident was not, it wasn't a technology problem. It wasn't a radar problem. It wasn't a mechanical problem. What it was a stupidity problem is what it was. Stupidity and stubbornness and pride and ego. Each of those captains was aware of the other ship's position. Each one of those captains was aware of the other ship's presence. Both had plenty of time to steer clear if they would have communicated with one another. But according to news reports, neither captain wanted to give way to the other one. They were too proud to yield. And then by the time they realized that the other person was just as stubborn as they were, it was too late to turn. And so the ships collided. Hundreds of people died as a result of that. And so we are told time and time and time again in scriptures that pride and ego have no place in the life of a Christian. That we're actually to be the exact opposite. We're supposed to consider others as more important than ourselves. It tells us this many times in Philippians. Simply says, consider others more than yourselves. And we need to do that. We need to not act like we're on opposing sides, like we're 2 ship captains staring at one another saying, okay, you blink first. No, you blink first. We need to get along with one another. We need to love one another. We need to model what that's like in a world, friends, in a world that is increasingly skeptical of why in the world the church even exists. I'll be honest with you. So then there's some other names that remind us of the importance of how we need to pray for our friends. Prayer, unselfish prayer. 2 guys named Epaphras, a guy named Luke. And so in verse 12, Paul writes, now Epaphras, who is one of you, and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I love this. Week 1 of this series, we learned a little bit about Epaphras. Epaphras was from Colossae. He is the one who was instrumental in starting the church, but evidently at some point he left Colossae, and the Christians back there, they may have been thinking, well, why in the world doesn't Epaphras come back? Doesn't he like us? Doesn't he care about us? But actually, he's doing the absolute greatest thing anyone can do for a church. Paul says, Epaphras, who is one of you, Colossians, he is one of you, he sends greetings, and he's always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God and be fully assured. He is in prayer for you. How often do we say to somebody, hey, I'll be praying for you, right? And then like we just don't. Like we just don't. Or if we remember to and we do, like it's just sort of some fly-by-night prayer, but it says that Epaphras wrestled in prayer. Wrestling, the word that we get our word agony from, agonizo. It's not just some flippant prayer, but it's heartfelt, it's intense. Epaphras is the only person in the Bible that Paul specifically singles out and commends for his prayer life. I think that's pretty amazing. We underestimate the power of prayer. We talked a little bit about this last week. We underestimate the power of prayer. So there was Epaphras, and then there's Luke. Then there's Luke. Paul calls him our dear friend, Luke the doctor. Now we know that Luke traveled with Paul. Luke had a front row seat to a lot of things that happened. He wrote the book of Luke. He wrote the book of Acts. Luke was Paul's personal physician because Paul had some physical ailments. He had a thorn in the flesh that he talks about in 2 Corinthians. Now Luke the doctor could have had a lot easier life. He could have had a lot more prestige, more physical safety. Certainly, he could have had a lot more money if he had a regular established practice. But he chose to travel with Paul because he was an unselfish, devoted friend. And this spirit of selflessness or unselfishness is so essential to a good friendship. How many of you know that selfish people don't make very good friends? I love Al McGuire. Some of you know who he is. Al McGuire, one of my all-time favorite sports announcers. I think he's passed now, but before that, he was the head basketball coach at Marquette University. And he used to like to tell the story of a guy that played for him at Marquette named Butch Lee. Now, Butch Lee was like an All-American, outstanding player, but he was like the most selfish player that McGuire ever had. So one day early in the season, he took him aside and he said, Butch, now you got to understand something. He said, there are 40 minutes in a basketball game. The other team's going to have the ball roughly about half of that. So that means we have 20 minutes with the ball. There are 5 players on the floor. So each player can have the ball about 4 minutes. He says, now, Butch, I've seen what you can do with the ball in the 4 minutes you have. He said, what I want to see is what you can do in the 36 minutes, what you can do when you don't have the ball. When the spotlight is not on you, when you're not taking that long jumper, when the spotlight's not on you, how can you help this team? Can you play defense? Can you crash the boards? Can you pass the ball? Can you set some screens? I want to see what you can do when you don't have the ball. And man, I tell you what, I think there's a lot of basketball teams, some of them shall remain nameless, IU, that really don't, like they have a problem because they got a lot of great players, but they're all kind of selfish. Now, that's going to change this year because they got a new coach, and he's going to set it all straight, right? IU's going to be awesome. Amen. Okay, so, but being selfish is so, like it's so unbiblical. Luke, he could have bragged a whole lot about his exploits, about his relationship with Paul, about how close he was, about how he wrote most of the New Testament. But in the book of Acts, he really doesn't even mention himself at all. At various times in the book of Acts, Luke writes, now, well, we did this, or we went there, or Paul said this, or whatever. He could have really bragged. He could have said, now, the other day, Paul and I, we sailed to Malta, and this and that and the other thing, and Paul and I did this. But no, it's just like, no, we went here, and we went there. And like he could have been so much more obnoxious because of who he was. But good friends, don't keep score. Good friends they don't get upset and jealous and become cold and distant when there are Facebook pictures of you with somebody else doing something else, Real friends really don't try to have this fear of missing out syndrome. They don't want it. At the end of his life, again, Paul wrote 2 Timothy. It's an amazing thing to read. But he writes in 2 Timothy 4:9, he says, "Now do your best, Timothy, to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved the world, has deserted me. He's gone to Thessalonica. Crescens is gone. Titus is gone." But who's with him still? It's Luke. Only Luke is with me. And I just think that in our last days, we better have some loyal friends who are still going to be with us. When things aren't good, when life gets us down, when no matter what's happening, that we will have friends who will still stand by our side. We may be wrong in whatever it is, but they'll stand by us. They won't desert us. Proverbs says there is a man who sticks closer, or there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. I want to be like Luke. I don't want to be like another name mentioned. Paul mentioned Demas. Demas in this list is one of them that doesn't really get a good report. And so in verse 14, Paul simply writes, "Demas sends greetings." Demas sends greetings. Now, Demas is only mentioned 3 times in the Bible, but they kind of trace an outline of a quitter or a defector. In Philemon, verse 24, Demas is called a fellow laborer. Colossians 4:14, Demas has no comment at all. In 2 Timothy 4:10, it says, "Because Demas loved this world, he has deserted me." And even here in Colossians, you see how Paul talks about the other believers. Faithful friend, dear servant, faithful minister. And then, Demas says, hey. Nothing about him. Just, Demas, and he says, hey. And then we get to that stunning, he loved the world, so he deserted me. I don't want to be like Demas. See, it's people like Mark, people like Epaphras, people like Tychicus and Barnabas and Onesimus and Philemon and you and me who serve the Lord. And there are some people who sometimes get a lot of praise and recognition and applause, but for most of us, most of the time, we may serve and do things to offer encouragement, or we may forgive, or a whole host of things, and only the Lord sees it. And then I think about all the people that have come before us in this place, and how most of them sacrificed and served for so long, and you don't even know their names. I was thinking of going down a list of names, but it's too many, and I would probably leave somebody out. But in the whole history of this church, there have been so many people, even in just the last 20 years since I've been here, so many people have wrestled in prayer, have served, have not been in the spotlight, have been friends and brothers and sisters. A lot of people are the reason why this church building is here. Maybe even probably the reason why you're here. Maybe one of the reasons why you'll be in heaven one day. And we mustn't forget them. We mustn't forget them. Like I said, I'd like to name them. I'd like to name them all. I'd like to put them up on the screen and say, this person did that and whatever. But you know what? They wouldn't want that in the first place. They didn't want that when they were alive. They certainly wouldn't want us to do it now that they're gone, because it really doesn't matter to them if they're recognized or not, because they're in heaven. And God knows everything about them. God knows every little thing they did to serve when maybe nobody else knew. God knows the way in which they gave faithfully to Christ Church year after year. No recognition, no applause. No name on a plaque, no special recognition. And I just think today there's a plague among Christians of, frankly, just kind of with everything that's going on in the world, what difference does it make? And there are many of you, maybe you wonder the same thing. Many of you have served faithfully in different ways for years. And I know that there are some times when you feel like quitting because you wonder what difference does it make? with everything that's going on in the world today, like what difference does it make what we do in this building? What difference does it make? But it makes a lot of difference. And so you keep serving. You encourage, you pray, you give, you serve, you teach, you sing, you lead, you volunteer when something needs done. You just give of yourself to the Lord. You may wonder why. You may wonder who cares. But let me tell you, God, your Father, knows, and He cares, and He sees you. And it's true that in the economy of the world, in the grand scheme of things in the world, it might not seem like what you do or what we do as a church is that important. But let me remind you, in much crazier times than this, it was the church that turned the Roman Empire upside down. 2,000 years ago. Don't tell me that it doesn't make any difference what we do in this place. But God knows, and God sees you. One of my favorite stories, one day, Jesus, he's kind of just sitting there with his disciples, and he's watching the temple. And he's just watching, like he's watching people put their offerings in, and some of them are making a huge show of it. You know, the offering receptacles were in such a way that they made this loud, clanky noise, and they would like to throw their money in there, so it made all kinds of racket. You know, see what I gave, see what I gave. And Jesus is just watching this. Like, he must have been so patient, because if I were him, I would have just like zapped those people. I would have been like, you know, like I don't know what, but I'd have zapped them, right? But he didn't do that, because he's a lot better than I am, obviously. But I love what he does. He sees this older lady, probably a widow, and he knows what she's going to do. He knows what she's about to do, and so he's like, "Hey, guys, come here. Come here. I want you to see this. I want you to see what she's going to do." And then they watched her put in everything she had, and then she just quietly walks away. Nobody else noticed. The disciples, they wouldn't have noticed if Jesus wouldn't have alerted them to it, but Jesus knew. Jesus knew. And God knows everything that we have done. Everything we've done to serve him. Everything that we do to love others, to encourage people, to forgive, to serve, to make this church what it is. God knows. And let me remind you, in case you have forgotten, that in the end, that is really the only thing, the only thing that matters. That God knows. Because it's this God who one day is going to welcome us home, and he's going to say to us, knowing everything about us, "Well done. Well done, good and faithful servant. Welcome home."